Well, hello, everyone. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you happen to be in the world. My name is Rita McGrath. I'm a professor at Columbia Business School and an author. And my Friday Fireside Chat guest is Tomas Chamorro-Premuzic, who is a psychologist, a professor, an entrepreneur, author, born and raised in Buenos Aires, as I understand it, but now you live in a multiple of places. The author of 10 books, including the one that I was hoping we would talk about today, which is Why Do So Many Incompetent Men Become Leaders? This is being recorded, so please don't put in chat or say anything that you don't want recorded for posterity. And at the moment, I understand you're the Chief Talent Officer at Manpower, among many other roles. Great. So I just thought, let's just start with the basic thesis, right? Which is the premise of the book is that it's just too easy for incompetent men, particularly incompetent men, but I guess incompetent people in general, to become leaders. And maybe just walk us through that line of thinking.
Yeah. So I guess, the book sets out to answer, well, and first, thank you for having me, Rita.
It's a pleasure. I've wanted to meet you for a long time.
It's a real honor, and I always listen or watch your fireside chats, and I notice there's almost a fire behind, right? It looks like
a fireside.
Yeah, it is a real. So it's not like when you get invited to brown bag lunches and there is no brown bag lunch. There's actually a fireside here. So anyway. The book sets out to answer that question. Why do so many incompetent men become leaders? And I often get asked in return, why didn't I just title it, Why Do So Many Incompetent People Become Leaders? And which could have worked, but the reality is that it is actually easier for incompetent people to become leaders when they're male than female. And the main argument I make is that the main answer to that question is that we're overly focused when we pick, nominate, or select people for leadership roles on their confidence rather than their competence, on their charisma rather than their humility, and on their narcissism rather than their integrity. So if we were able to pick leaders based on their competence, humility, and integrity, as opposed to their confidence, charisma, and narcissism, we would not just end up with more women leaders, but also more better leaders. So that's the book in a nutshell.
It's absolutely brilliant. And one of the things you make, I don't think you put it this way, but that, we're, as humans, we're kind of hardwired to follow that, we've got, I call it lizard brains, right? You've got this, if a saber-toothed tiger is coming towards you, you want the person who's going to be able to say, go, run in that direction, right? And we're sort of pre-programmed to think that that's what leadership today is, but it's really not. I mean, what leadership today is about is, bringing the best in people together and guiding them towards a common goal, right? So
yeah, that's right. And and I like the kind of lizard brain figure. I also recommend to our audience that they check out a recent book by Mark van Vugt, the evolutionary psychologist who studied leadership, who talks about the mismatch. So the pathological mismatch between traits that maybe in prehistorical, pre-savanna times were actually quite attractive and also beneficial for leadership, but are now outdated. So imagine that our brains, if we evolved our brains through 200,000 years or so, and we're still using these archaic models, they're not very valid today when you need to know whether people have empathy, EQ, curiosity, critical thinking, self-awareness, etc. And another book that I would recommend is a book called Ultra Society, that by a Russian, also kind of a more anthropologist, evolutionary psychologist, who talked about actually the misconception that, throughout most of our times, we were led by these macho-like alpha males. Actually, hunter-gatherer societies were very egalitarian, and they were often much more gender balanced in that, we lived in small groups where everyone had a reputation for being either trustworthy or not, competent or not, and people chose their leaders based on this reputation. But the world was a lot simpler because you always hung out with the same people, and actually talent was relatively easy to judge, right? It was kind of stuff that is very behavioral and that you could see. Now the world is more complex. So, if we want to make decisions on whom to vote for a president based on a 10-minute presidential debate, it's going to be tricky.
Hmm. Hmm. And one of the things you've talked about is some of the biases that cause us not to elect leaders with. I think you talk about integrity, ethical, competent, and humble, smart, kind, and honest. I mean, those are all wonderful words. But if that's what we want, why isn't that what we pick?
Well, I think partly we don't really want that, right? We
Oh,
need
oh.
that. We need leaders who are smart, kind, and honest.
Mhm.
But I think if you hear so many people say that, and we've been sort of paying lip service to humility for a while now, and every time that there is a corruption scandal or a leader misbehaves, we talk about the importance of morality and ethics. And of course, today we talk a lot about leaders making rational decisions and being data driven as an asset. But we talk about it a lot because we don't get it, right? So we wouldn't talk about it so much if this was the norm.
Mm.
And so I think at the end of the day, the reality is that what we want is leaders who are entertaining. We're fascinated by this kind of morbid or toxic dark side that leaders have, which is why, we won't have too many movies on Angela Merkel, who is a great leader, but, quite uneventful. No scandals, rational, not ideological, objective, fair, pragmatic. That's not interesting.
Well, you wrote
Instead,
a wonderful piece about her day. She gets up in
yeah,
the morning, has coffee with her husband, goes to meetings for which she's well prepared, doesn't interrupt people. I mean, yeah, how boring can you be?
exactly. I mean, personally, it will be quite interesting in a documentary on her in a movie. But let's face it, most people would fall asleep compared to, let's say, watching, I don't know, The Wolf of Wall Street, or equivalent. I mean, the reality is most of the leaders that feature in the news or in the media prominently that get covered, even people who are arguably exceptional from a talent perspective, like Elon Musk,
Mhm.
are quite scandalous. They're very colorful. They have no filter. And, they have these very almost antisocial tendencies that we celebrate, I think, because in our lizard brains, we are seduced, maybe even intimidated by these narcissistic traits.
Mhm. Mhm. Well, another person that comes to mind would be Steve Jobs, right? Who, on the one hand, total genius, right? But on the other hand, apparently not a very pleasant person in work or life.
Yeah, and so this is it, right? So if our audience reads Walter Isaacson's biography of Steve Jobs, they would realize, what an obnoxious person he was. I mean, there's a reason he got fired from his own company more than once. But he would park his car in the disabled parking space of his own company, alienate people, bully, etc. And what's quite interesting is for a while he was alive, people would talk about the Steve Jobs paradox, as if, because he was so difficult and obnoxious, we all have to behave like unpleasant people and that's going to drive our career success. No, first of all, he's the exception, not the norm to the rule. And secondly, it's quite interesting that now, I think a couple of days ago, the Wall Street Journal covered Tim Cook, right? Apple now back to being the most valuable company in the world, 1.9 trillion valuation. Surely he must have contributed to some of that. And Tim Cook, from a personality standpoint, is very much the opposite of Steve Jobs. Granted, some people would say, yeah, but Steve Jobs was the visionary, he created everything, and they're still selling iPads and iPhones. But you could argue that the company is performing better without him.
Mm. Mm. Well, there's an interesting observation that my friend Steve Blank makes. And Steve, for those of you that don't know Steve, he's a serial entrepreneur, started, I think, 9 companies, took 3 of them public, teaches now at Columbia and Berkeley. And one of his observations is that one of the interesting things you see in companies is you have a visionary, and they create this sort of Steve Jobs-like reality distortion field. But in most companies, there's only room for one of them. And their number 2 tends to be a really strong operational guy like Tim Cook. And so when the visionary leaves, the logical choice to replace the visionary is the number 2, who's more of the operational person. And so what you have is this kind of visionary growth development, and then much more operational. And then, in many cases, the operational guy goes away, and then a new visionary comes in. And he would cite Disney as an example where that's happened a couple of times. So I just, it's fascinating to me. And the other thing about Steve Jobs that I think is really interesting is there was a period, as you point out, where whatever it was you wanted to do as a CEO, as a founder or an entrepreneur or whatever, you would look at Steve Jobs and your view of what you wanted to do is totally colored by your interpretation. So if you were going to be a real jerk, right? Oh, well, he was a real jerk. So that's the kind of leader I need to be. But if you were going to be, design sensitive and aesthetic and create these incredible teams, well, that's what I want to be, right? So it was almost like divorced from reality. You made of him what you wanted to in a way.
Yeah. Exactly. And, I agree about the number two in command, or the more corporate CEO, COO or CEO in the period of maturity, right? And let's face it, I mean, before Tim Cook, Apple tried that and it didn't work out when Scully came and he fired Steve Jobs, and then, the company almost disappeared. Having said that, I am somewhat encouraged by the fact that even if you look now at the state of big tech companies, I mean, who were in Congress not so long ago declaring, and basically arguing whether they're too big to fail or not, etc. If you look at the profile, and Satya Nadella wasn't there because Microsoft was and is now not on the table. But if you look at the profile, other than arguably Jeff Bezos, who has become kind of more of a, alpha male and Rambo-like figure in recent years, the others are very much low-key, more empathetic. Okay, Zuckerberg, is I think a different kind of creature, but I think people are starting to wake up to the reality that there is a very different requirement of competencies and qualities needed to entertain us in a Netflix TV series or documentary, and to be a great leader, which isn't new to anyone who has been doing research, scientific or otherwise, in this area. But actually, we do need to fight as much as possible to change people's outdated archetypes of leadership traits and what good leadership should look like.
Yeah, I was talking to Jeff Moore about Alphabet and Google, and he pointed out that Sundar Pichai wasn't like grasping for the job. That the reason he got chosen is because the only time people could come to an agreement about anything was when he was in the room. That he managed to kind of bring people together. The CEO of Unilever, same sort of thing. Not somebody who was like reaching for the job in a major way. So you recently had an article on why we don't select leaders, and I thought it would be just interesting to take each of your 5 points. In turn. And the first one was not being serious about integrity, which you've touched on already. What would it look like to be serious about integrity? Would people is there a test you can give people, or how would you find out?
I mean, so integrity is quite problematic, right? Because even though you can predict it with things like science-based assessment or archival data, historical data, I mean, 360 feedback or even upward feedback, if you ask people, do you trust your boss, and you aggregate that, that is a wonderful predictor of integrity. Do you think your boss will betray you or take advantage of you, and you aggregate that predicts. It's never perfect, as you know, it's not rocket science, but on the one hand, you can use things like a Big Five personality assessment to predict whether somebody is going to engage in unethical or more ethical behaviors, right? So yes, we could model it and predict for it, but the problem with that is that looks a lot like just boring conscientiousness, and it can smell a little bit too much like conformity, you know? And so people don't like that. And actually, if you look at real leaders with a capital L, they're often quite antisocial because they want to disrupt the status quo and change it. They have a profound desire, unhappy desire, driven by their non-conformity with the world, to change it. So they look a lot, they are troublemakers, which is why most of the entrepreneur founders who succeed, and I know you've covered extensively, actually are school dropouts or, have trouble. They're quite unemployable from a personality perspective,
Richard Branson comes to mind.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, Richard Branson, and Steve Jobs, and of course Bill Gates, but even before that, Henry Ford, Carnegie, Rockefeller, etc. Now, yeah, exactly. Hershey. But they have the talents to back it up, and they're part of the 0.1%. So if you get to the point where you want to understand moral leadership, integrity, or ethical leadership in a more philosophical and deeper way, it's quite complicated, and you have to put up with this a more idealized and utopian type of personality who is going to be a bit anarchic. I mean, even people like Nelson Mandela or Gandhi had this profile, right? And they were anti-establishment profoundly, but they're going to replace the status quo with something better. That's quite complicated in general because you don't know whether what they have in mind is something pro-social. So I call it, in a way, it's like narcissistic altruism. They want to impose their own vision and reality distortion on the world, but actually they have ethical, moral principles and goals in mind. That's hard to assess with a science-based assessment or in an interview. But if you just look at people from a perspective of their megalomaniac vision and disruptive personality, you're going to select a lot of people who are going to create more damage than good. And by the way, for women, it's very complicated because when women show this more disciplined, conscientious, self-control, ethical, pro-social type of integrity, we dismiss them as not leader-like or boring, conformist, too kind and caring. They don't stand out. So they're kind of too nice. And when they show this kind of more grandiose, megalomaniac, visionary type of altruistic leadership, we're intimidated by them because we're not used to females expressing this, where people are generally quite uncomfortable with charisma as it is displayed in women. Look at Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who would be a good example of that. And she does scare a lot of people, and people are put off by her, and they are making remarks that they wouldn't make about her if she was a man.
Oh, totally. One of the things, among my other activities is I run a program at Columbia for executive women called Women in Leadership. And one of the things we talk about in that program is what my colleague Adam Galinsky calls the low power double bind, which is that in any society, the group that's in the minority or the group that has low power has this exact problem. If you're too nice and warm and, welcoming and all that stuff, you're a lightweight. And if you're too aggressive, you get called abrasive or worse. And very, kind of very, very interesting. So the second point you made was that we get seduced, that we sort of fall into the spell of these narcissistic, psychopathic almost personalities. And it leads me to wonder, do we really want to judge people on the basis of how entertaining or interesting they are? When, maybe what we want is someone who's just a lot more boring and just gets the job done. And I wonder if there's a way to sort of make that at least something we check for. Yeah.
Well, first of all, this is one of the hardest ones to explain. And, I suffer from my own kind of background and experience because I am, a recovering psychoanalyst at heart, having been, educated in Argentina in an area of Buenos Aires that has the highest concentration of psychoanalysts per capita in the world.
Is that right?
Yeah, it's actually
Why
called,
is that?
It used to be called Villa Freud. I don't know, it's a combination of sort of a neurotic intellectualism combined with tango and perpetually declining, political society, I guess. But then it's self-perpetuating because in order to become a shrink, a psychoanalyst, you have to be in therapy yourself, So it's like a reverse pyramid scheme in a way. We create more and more. And, of course, I'm not going to argue that Freud is apt or kosher for the standards of mainstream academic science today. Having said that, he was quite intuitive, and in his observations, much like some observations are now backed up by neuroscience research, which he didn't have access to because the tools were not available. And he has a wonderful explanation to answer that question, which is that he says that, typically the best you can hope for is that people replace their own narcissistic self-love with the love for someone else who promises to love them back. And that's how good relationships happen, and why we marry people who look a lot like us, because it's a legitimate way to display our narcissism. That's why managers and leaders hire people like themselves and call them high potential, because they love themselves. And from a follower perspective, we gravitate towards people who are narcissistic because they have these very enticing megalomaniac visions that tap into our own narcissism, So I'm going to make you great. I'm going to make you special. vote for me, trust me, and we're going to take things to a different level, etc., etc., etc. So now, this is one that is easy to address because every manager, hiring manager, leader, HR professional, or interviewer who ends up an interview with someone and says, I really like this guy or girl, they are very confident, they show great culture fit, we would really get along, I love their style, etc. They're probably focusing on these qualities, you know. So, you know, you could argue that the only way to focus more on substance and less on style is if you remove humans from the equation and use data assessments, like, you know, make selection for leaders like blind tasting of wines. But we probably won't get there, right? But I find it quite interesting that the very things we want to attend to are the things we shouldn't attend to today, which is what's the person's gender, age, ethnicity, social class, accent, you know. If you remove all of this and you actually focus on what they have achieved, their experience, their expertise, etc., and you make it more like blind tasting, you're going to debias selection and end up with better people, you know. But you have to also then debias the performance evaluations. Because if I hire you because I really like you and you're confident and narcissistic in the interview, and I'm in charge of rating your performance after I hire you a year later, guess what? I'm not gonna reach the conclusion that I made a mistake, that I was wrong, and I'm still gonna like you for the same wrong reasons.
That's so powerful.
But you know, if this applies to heads of states and you have a pandemic and there is a real crisis to deal with, guess what? Reality check is out there.
Absolutely. What it makes me think of is in symphony orchestras, when they first began to introduce the blind audition process, that, and as I understand it, the reason that this was initially done was there was somewhere in Europe, and I can't remember the details of the story, but basically it was somebody's nephew wanted to get in the symphony, but there was concern that that would be treated with accusations of nepotism. And so they said, well, okay, what we're going to do is we'll have the player play behind a curtain, and they'll take their shoes off, and so we won't know, you know, anything about them, except the judges will then rate them on how well they performed. And one of the completely unintended consequences of this was all of a sudden women started getting places in symphony orchestras because it was a debiased selection process.
Exactly. So you have to do a blind tasting, you know, I mean, and this happens when you remove the humans from the equation, or when you can really say someone's achievements have the ability to speak for themselves. Right. But you know, it's very hard in leadership because leadership is still so much about chemistry, likability, and politics.
Yeah, absolutely. So then you point out that the other interesting sort of distortion in the whole leadership equation is that people who seek to become leaders often seek to become leaders not because they actually care about other people, but because they care about their own power and status. And I think that's super interesting. I mean, my undergraduate degree was in political science. And one of the theories they talk about in political science is, and this was done with the personality studies of presidents, and that a lot of times these presidents were sort of chronically insecure power seekers. And one of the reasons they wanted the role was that sort of the validation on the one hand, but also then the opportunity to exercise power, which I thought was really interesting. Just I think it's just such an interesting point.
Yeah, and so the question there is, how do you move beyond that, and how do you address that challenge? And I think, you know, first of all, you have to provide some career progression alternatives for people that do not require them to be in charge of others. You know, if your only possibility to move up in your career is that you have to manage people, you know, let's face it, you're not just going to end up with a lot of people who are motivated by greed, power, ambition, and they want to have titles and more money and be respected, which is fine, you know, and that will always happen, but also explains why more men than women are motivated in leadership roles. But you're also going to end up with a lot of people who don't have the talent or the potential to become natural leaders, which is how the Peter principle emerges, right? Eventually, everyone rises to their own level of mediocrity, because what's the logic of taking somebody away from a job they were doing quite well because they were doing it quite well, you suddenly give them a team of 10 or 20 people to manage. And they have to stop doing what they're good at and then, do something that they might not even be interested in. I mean, in professional team sports, you have it a lot. The best individual players are rarely the greatest managers, and the greatest managers were often not illustrious individual players. So you can disentangle this if you provide career opportunities for people that don't involve managing others. And you see some companies doing it, right? So if you're a brilliant individual contributor, good at strategy, innovation, thinking, task, problem solving, I don't want you to manage people, and I'm going to enable you to advance and have more impact and pay you more as you deliver. And then the other thing is that you have to change how you assess and evaluate leadership performance. Ironically, leadership, which should be a resource for the group, the team, something that enables them to work as a cohesive unit and perform as an integrated, coordinated unit, it is a resource for the group and team, and it should be evaluated by what your followers or subordinates think of you and how they are delivering. But everyone is promoted based on what their boss and manager thinks of them, So inevitably, it creates this kind of paradoxical and somewhat toxic situation where your performance becomes detached from your reputation. And if you're busier managing up and sucking up to your boss and managing impressions and playing the game, the dirty game of politics, and you're Machiavellian and engage in tactics of manipulations, you will advance your career, even if you're not being a good influence on your team. And those who are valued by their teams might be overlooked. Again, there are agenda differences here as well, because women are more likely, on average, to focus on the team, develop others' potential, nurture their talents, and spend less time politicking and managing up. In fact, when we point the finger at women and say, you should lean in, we're in effect telling them, why are you not promoting yourself more and, playing this game of politics or bullshitting your way up so that you're more successful? Which in a way is pragmatic advice, but it perpetuates a very corrupt and flawed, system.
Yeah, and I run into this all the time with the Women in Leadership program, because you've got this tendency, I think, in that sort of world of which is not, I'm a strategy innovation person, so the whole women thing is sort of I recently adopted it as a bit of a challenge, but one of the challenges is there's a trope that sort of goes, fix the women. If we could just get the women to behave more like the men, they would be more successful. And so what we try to say is, well, there's some things you can do for yourself that will help you, articulate your vision and your brand, and some of the things you need to do to get a little bit of that charismatic, follow me, I know what I'm doing kind of flavor to it. But the more important challenge is, how do we change the organization so that it is better able to make these kinds of judgments, better able to accept diversity. And that's another thing that I think your work really sheds an interesting light on, which is, and it recalls some work that Kathy Phillips did. And briefly, what she did was she had a creative problem-solving task, and she took homogenous groups, largely composed of white men, and diverse groups composed of men, women of color, blah, 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 and she set them to a creative task. And one of the most interesting findings to me was that the homogenous groups felt great about what they had done. We all got in the room, we spoke the same language, it went so smoothly, we finished in record time, and the diverse groups were just wildly uncomfortable. It was like, I didn't know how to communicate, what were they trying to do? It was so effortful. And yet the homogenous groups did a lot worse on the problem-solving task than the diverse groups. Now, one of the things that I fear is, if you look at the leadership or entities, the leadership C-suite people of most of the world's organizations, they're kind of male and homogenous, and they probably think they're doing great. And yet empirical evidence suggests that is not, not the case.
Yeah. So, a couple of quick observations. The first is that, and I'm a big fan of Francesca Gino's work and all the kind of, constructive nonconformity research, but it's really quite interesting because, of course, and Amy Edmondson, of course, on psychological safety. The the most advanced form of leadership that you can see today involves creating truly diverse team and an inclusive culture that translates that diversity into a plus. Because if you just get diversity, people aren't going to get along, and it's going to backfire. You know, right. It's I say it's like a root canal without anesthesia. You know, it's not gonna work. Having said that, to your point, if you're evaluating success or performance or effectiveness from a self-report or self-perceived perspective, of course, you know, reality distortion can go a long way. I mean, humans are really good at it. They're really good at making self-serving and self-enhancing interpretations of the world. Mm-hmm. And let's face it, most of us, if there is a choice between understanding reality as it is or interpreting in a way that makes us feel great about ourselves, we will choose the latter. Mm-hmm. But if you push this logic to its kind of ultimate extreme, it's going to be very hard for most managers to deliberately employ, hire, and promote people who disagree with them. Mm-hmm. And actually, you know, who on earth wants to work with people who are a pain in the neck and who are difficult to manage and who tell them that they're wrong all the time? You know, it's a really utopian kind of a destination, and we should push for it, because the alternative is groupthink, you know, a cult rather than culture. Mm-hmm. And, you know, it's kind of a self-destructive in a way. But I think the best case scenario is somewhere in the middle of these two extremes, right?
Yeah. Well, I think also that when I look at people who are really good at making sense out of uncertain circumstances, and we've had a lot of questions in the chat about what kind of leadership do we need right now, you know, that we're dealing with this pandemic. And one of the things I would observe is they're very good at listening to having their assumptions challenged. So an example would be Alan Mulally when he was at Ford. And he talked about one team, and he talked about, you know, we're going to have this meeting once a week where we talk about what's going wrong, you know, and then help each other with that. So rather than hide the bad news, get it out of there. And he had a wonderful phrase, which I thought was great. And the phrase was, "You can't manage a secret." Yeah. And I think part of what makes Alan unusual among a lot of the CEOs I've ever met is that his ability to get people to indeed constructively disagree or say, that's not how I see it, or, you know, from where I sit, that doesn't look like the right choice. You know, it's a very unusual quality.
It is a very unusual quality, and I think, you know, the concept, and I know that, you know, there's a book coming out which is a strong contender for best business book of this year, which you might have seen in preprint, on kind of cultures of radical transparency, and mostly Netflix, right, based. And, you know, it's not the natural thing. I mean, it's not the natural thing.
Aaron Meyer's book?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah. So just a little promotion here. So Aaron's going to be with me later in September.
Great.
September
That's wonderful.
23rd. Yeah, so she and Reed Hastings have written this book about the culture at Netflix. So I'm going to have her talk about that. But say more about the radical transparency.
It's not the natural thing, right? So if I'm sure we have managers and leaders or people with managerial responsibilities listening to us right now, and the default option, if you're a successful person who is in a management or leadership position and has attained a certain status, is to shy away from negative feedback and criticism. And the default behavior of those who you manage is, of course, to tell you that you're great and suck up to you. Maybe they're even being honest because they respect you and they admire you, but it might be that it's good for them to tell you that you're great and feed into your ego. So you can break this natural kind of force by actually making it. That's why psychological safety is so important. But you have to create the conditions and make it easier for others to critique you. And that's, I think, why radical transparency is very important as a cultural bastion, but it's not natural. So I love to ask my team, what could I have done better? If you were in my position, what would you have done differently? Tell me 3 things that disappointed you about, you know, my management or leadership this year. And so if you force everyone to speak up, and of course you don't punish them when they do, then it's uncomfortable, but you can actually develop your leadership skills. And we need more of that. And to answer your question, you know, there's been, of course, over the last 5 months, I've been asked a lot, what type of leadership style is needed in a crisis or to manage a pandemic. And I said, well, we need leaders who are smart and data driven and capable of making rational decisions. We need leaders who are curious and able to learn new things, because this is unparalleled. And with the word unprecedented has become a cliche and we shouldn't use it anymore, right? Because of this. We need leaders who are humble and understand their limitations. And we need leaders who have empathy and who are honest and who are coachable and self-aware. Mm-hmm. So do we need a very different type of leader? Yes, because usually we didn't get this. But actually, the pandemic and the crisis has emphasized that what we needed before is even more important now. Mm-hmm. Because again, we shouldn't have needed a pandemic to realize that we're generally better off when we have leaders who are smart, kind, and honest. But the pandemic and a crisis exposes those leaders who are not. When everything is going well, you're more likely to get away with deficits around smart, kind, and honest. But now, we really need that. So, so I think sometimes, it is a little bit like, I don't know, the meteorite or the asteroid hits the earth and some people were better able to cope with that or not. Or like the person who is taken to ER and they have a heart attack because they haven't been exercising enough or they've been eating more unhealthy. There are warning signs that you can leverage to learn and get better. Mm-hmm. Or if you ignore it, we will go back to the same and the same and the same over and over again. Progress is not a straight line, but we do have the capacity to learn from our mistakes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I've been studying a lot is this whole notion of who benefits and who doesn't from economic resources, and the rise of a really bad jobs kind of economy at the bottom of the economic strata. I just think it's a very concerning thing. And I think we're going to need leaders who are able to better cope with that sort of social contract issue. And I do think it's important that there's empathy and that there's those kinds of things. And of course, one of the big discussions is, are we still going to be, bowing to the all-knowing power of the shareholders, or are we going to think of, balancing things out a little bit more? And it'd be interesting to see what kind of leadership.
Do you think, there is change in the air? There is a paradigmatic shift coming, and let me qualify this question. I often think ultimately, and I try to look at things from a non-ideological, apolitical perspective, and I'm under no illusion that I manage, but I try, right? My sense is that, if the average American or the model American woke up with Denmark as a context, they will be profoundly unhappy still today. And if the average Dane, of course, woke up with the American context, which by the way means more wealth, bigger stock market, big tech, etc., driving, I think it depends a lot on what you want to optimize for. If your measure of progress is how well the average person is doing, then clearly there are signs of decline in the US and a lot of Western countries because inequality is widening, and social mobility has gone down here in the last 40 or 50 years. But if your idea is to optimize for how successful the uber rich can be and how many billionaires you have, of course, America is doing very well. So do you think there is a change in priorities and shift? I'm interested in that because ultimately that's how you measure success, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So the way I would frame that is if you look at the first Gilded Age in the United States, which was roughly the period from after the Civil War to about 1910, what you had was basically class warfare. I mean, you had incredible wealth among the elites. And just the mass of workers just in terrible situation. I mean, Dickensian, horrible, almost, just really, really bad conditions. And then there was a massive recession in 1893. And that set in motion really significant shifts in power among labor organizers and so forth. So let's fast forward to now. What we've got is some similarities and some big, big differences. So the things that are similar are we've got massive inequality. You've got concentration of power among corporates in a few hands. So very similar to Standard Oil and the things that we had back then. What we don't have is that sort of class warfare consciousness among people at the bottom of the economic rung. And I mean, a lot of jobs got created in the expansion post 2008, but they're crappy jobs. There are 36 million Americans right now who earn less than $15 an hour. That is not enough to live on. And so I think there are the seeds of something that could produce a different kind of conversation. I don't know whether those seeds will actually be ignited, or whether it's just going to be the elites continuing to perpetuate frankly, the system that's worked really well for them. I'm not making bets. What I would say is there's at least 4 possible scenarios, right? There's a absolute misery scenario where the economy is just flat, and we are just continuing to be so unequal. But there's also a scenario where you could see leadership come in that would say, hey, the way resources have been allocated in society are not serving us well. And by a lot of metrics, the U.S. is not doing very well. Our rates of innovation have come down. Business formation is down. Profitability of individual companies is up, but the sort of broad base for the next generation of prosperity is not really where it is.
Yeah.
So, it's interesting.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think it's also very hard for the average person and voter to take a long-term perspective. I mean, I generally think everyone votes with their own best interests at heart. And I don't think people are stupid or naive. It's hard to know whom to trust, and it's hard sometimes to choose someone who can even deliver when they have the right intentions. But what's very hard, and there's almost no practical purpose for an individual voter to take into account a 1,000 or 5,000 year perspective, that put things into a context. And so it's interesting, and I think sometimes it's a little bit like you look at yourself in the mirror every day and you see no change. But if you look at yourself 20 years ago or 40 years ago, you can see big changes, and ultimately leaders are the main agent of these changes, good and bad.
Mm-hmm. So one question from our viewers was, is there a behavior you think leaders that are in place now need to unlearn?
I mean, confidence, of course. It's just, I often say in my, 20 years or so of coaching executives that if I have to summarize that job, it's not just about giving them feedback they don't want to get, but also lowering their confidence, because most suffer from being overly confident, not underconfident, which is and that, by the way, includes women, not just men. So I think it comes with being in a position of power to kind of overrate yourself and your expectations. So we say humility is important, but it's not just the ability to pretend that you are humble and modest and self-deprecate, but internal humility, questioning yourself. I mean, I think imposter syndrome in leaders is a wonderful thing. If you don't believe your own hype and you have the ability to be, woken up by night by your own nightmares of thinking you're a fraud, great, because you're going to do something to close that gap, between your self-perceptions and your actual talents. I also think that, intuition, and I've seen in the chats come up, someone referencing Malcolm Gladwell and probably about, Blink. He actually has a good definition of intuition there. And I don't know if it's his or not, but feelings about facts. It's very hard for us to not pay attention to our feelings about facts. But, there are the facts. Reality, as someone once said, is that which doesn't go away because you stop thinking about it. So I think being data-driven and reality-oriented is really important. And for that, leaders need to unlearn their intuition, which is terribly difficult if you're relying on your experience and you succeeded thus far based on, your gut feeling.
Absolutely. So recently you've written about authenticity, which, and in the popular mind, in a lot of the sort of coaching leadership literature, they talk about you got to be an authentic leader and be vulnerable and bring your whole self to work. And you're one of the few voices I've read that says, maybe not so fast.
Yeah. Well, and I would distinguish between the two. I think vulnerabilities are a more interesting and nuanced kind of quality in leaders. And Amy Edmondson and I are just working on a piece on this
Oh,
for
you're working with Amy.
HBR on the
Great.
vulnerable leader. And I think it's very interesting because it has the potential to decrease our interest or attention for super tough and megalomaniac overconfident leaders. Of authenticity, however, I am a big critic. First of
Mm.
all, I think it's very poorly defined. What does it even mean? I mean, I've been trying to not be myself every day, and I'm struggling. Somehow I'm always me. I have no other option, right? I mean, I tried to be you, I tried to be Miles Davis, and I tried to be Lionel Messi, but I can't. I'm still me. So if by authenticity we mean just be yourself in the way that you don't worry about what others think of you and you are the natural version of you, an unfiltered and uninhibited version of you, I think that's very dangerous advice for young people. If they do that, they will probably have trouble. Most of the people who succeed in the world in any environment are pretty good at putting their best self at work and present. Irving Goffman has, of course, done some great work on this in the 60s and 70s on self-presentation and the theater of work, etc. You should care about what others think of you. And that doesn't mean that you're going to be a fake or a fraud. But unfortunately, we're not paid by our employers or careers for just being ourselves, saying what we think and doing what we like. I mean, the real you or the unfiltered version of you is someone who maybe 4 or 5 people in the world have learned to love or at least tolerate. And, you shouldn't assume that your colleagues or your boss are in that category.
That's
So,
wonderful.
I do think that, this is advice that comes in the context of the consumer society that tells us just be you, we value you for who you really are, and you are special and better than everyone else. Well, that's not true. You're
Mm.
most likely close to average in every category, just like everyone else. And that's not a bad thing because the world is fundamentally optimized for people who are close to the in between thing. And I'm not trying to promote conformity and mindless obedience here, but let's not be fooled by the idea that if you tweet obnoxious comments, you're going to be Elon Musk, or if you tell people that they're morons, you're going to be Steve Jobs, because they have the talents to back it up.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
we admire these people, but you wouldn't want to work for them or with them. And I think civilization is mostly a successful product of repressing our unfiltered and toxic tendencies.
Interesting. So one of the things that you've talked about very recently is so we now have this idea of some people are going to go back to the office, some people are going to be working virtually, and the political landmine that can open up. And since that's quite topical, I thought perhaps if you could elaborate on that.
Well, yes, because I've been reading lots of interesting work, writings, and research, and aside from doing my own research on this, and this kind of old debate has now reemerged as to whether people are better working from home or working in an office, and there's obviously pros and cons to both. But then I thought it's a stupid question because one size does not fit all, and some people will prefer one, the others will prefer the other. So surely flexible alternatives or hybrid workplaces are the future, and if you can offer a choice, which a lot of companies have been doing even before the pandemic, that's the best case scenario. Having said so, I think actually there is a big problem with giving people the option if you still value presentism more. If there are brownie points or bonus points for showing up, and let's say we have an important leadership meeting and 10 people are in the boardroom and 50 people are dialing in or on Zoom, and a lot of wheelings and dealings, politicking, influencing deals are made when you're not on Zoom, which happened before, of course, then inequalities will exacerbate. And furthermore, there's going to be additional gains in political capital and reputation for those who show up. And my favorite comment in the early stages of the pandemic, when people were sent back home, a client of mine said, but without the office, how will I pretend to work? And it's a wonderful comment because it's both cynical and the reality of the fact that most people are still rewarded or not for the reputation and appearance. So hybrid and having a dual structure is great if companies learn to evaluate output, what people produce, and we move past the kind of precarious stage of presentism.
Yeah, the FaceTime kind of issue. Yeah, I mean, one of my students years ago was working at a financial services firm, and what he would do at about 5 o'clock is he would put his jacket over the back of his chair. He'd get a fresh can of Coke from the Coke machine, and he'd open it up. And he'd programmed his computer screen to sort of have a screensaver that looked a lot like a spreadsheet. And then he went off to South Street Seaport and had a couple of hours of drinking with his buddies, came back, picked up his jacket and went home. And nobody was the wiser.
Well, I have a even like another kind of loop or variation of that story, which is in one of my earliest business trips to Japan. I was on my own, jet lag, late in a sushi bar, and there was this guy with his suit jacket, Japanese. We started talking, and he would buy rounds of beer and drinks, and we talked. And I said, okay, I have to go home now because I've been fired from my job 6 months ago, but my wife doesn't know, and I'm continuing with the same. So he wasn't just pretending to work to his boss, but at home, right? And only in Japan could that happen, taken to that extreme. But it's like, wow, his honor is still at stake, and I was his vehicle for pretending that he's still working with his wife. So,
That's a wonderful story. So we've got a few minutes left, and I thought what might be fun to talk about is remedies. And I pulled sort of 4 out of some of what I've seen. So get rid of interviews, find some kind of objective measures of output, promote on competence, humility, and integrity, and stop imposing higher standards for women than we do for men. And I think at one point you've made the observation too that the fact that so many women leaders are doing really well in this pandemic is that they probably had to be a lot better and work a lot harder to get to leadership positions than equivalent, men did. So are there other things we should be thinking of to begin to get the better leadership that we would all benefit from?
No, so I'm a big. I mean, I have a vivid imagination and I love complexity. But at the end of the day, I think if solutions aren't simple, they're not going to be practical. So nobody can predict, and we've especially realized that in the last 6 months, what the future will bring. And who knows? Hopefully we'll save the planet. And not so long ago, we used to worry about AI and machines taking on our jobs. And look what happened, right? It's not the machines, it's just a virus, right? Which in the grand scheme of things isn't like precisely novelty. It happens every 100 or 200 years. But I think that for us to prepare for an uncertain or unpredictable future, we have to bet on safe options. That's why I think, even though we don't know what the future will bring, we're probably going to be better off if we put people in charge who are smart, kind, and honest. And we know how to do that. This is the opportunity, right? And so I wrote an article with Aviva Wittenberg-Cox on whether the pandemic will reshape people's views on leadership. And it's not really about exacerbating the gender war or the ideological discussion on gender, but it's just to remind people that we are better off if we have people in charge who make data-driven, rational, logical decisions, care about others, and have integrity and ethics. And yes, in the pandemic, female heads of states have shown that they have these qualities more often than men. And of course, they were elected or selected in cultures that enabled these more meritocratic selections. So I think, we have learned a lot of what works and what doesn't. So often it's just basically trying to suppress our self-destructive tendencies. I mean, and again, if you take climate or the environment as another example, we know what the evidence says and what behaviors will improve things, but it's sometimes hard for people to make the right choices between apparently not so enticing short-term decisions and wiser long-term decisions. It's no different from saving or looking after your health or looking after your children.
Yeah, as my friend Marshall Goldsmith is fond of saying, none of these things are complicated. They're just really hard.
Yes,
You know?
exactly. Yes, absolutely.
So one of the groups that I'm sort of loosely affiliated with is a group here called Extraordinary Women on Boards, and it's women who kind of came together out of a desire to really share their experiences and so forth. And what I'm wondering is, especially for publicly traded firms, if you think about making some of these ideas a board level conversation, where, I mean, fundamentally the boards hire, fire, evaluate the CEO, right? That's one of the jobs that they have to do. Is there some way we could begin to influence those conversations? Because when I think about the publicly traded companies I work with, certainly I don't think that comes up at the board level. People aren't saying, is this person kind? Is this person honest? Does this person, maybe a little bit about integrity, but it tends to be more in the sort of HR compliance form of integrity rather than, is this a real person who really operates fundamentally with integrity? So any hope there?
Well, I think smart, we typically value more, but we're confused by what it means, because often it's still, we focus too much on hard skills, resume, experience. And, when you say someone is the smartest person in the room, it no longer has a good connotation, because it doesn't necessarily mean that they are a fast learner, curious and logical or data driven. But it's kind and honest that we undervalue. And, uh, um, it's important to understand that men are currently disadvantaged when they show kindness and when they show honesty, because people think, oh, let's dismiss them. They're not leadership material, because we assume that things like drive, greed, fearlessness, or recklessness are more important qualities in leadership. So I think, I'm often asked whether I believe in quotas and affirmative action. And I say, actually, generically, as a principle, I don't like it, because I believe that you can, have more women or more minorities in charge, but if they just replicate the bad habits or behaviors of the status quo, it will backfire. If we have more women in publicly traded companies, boards, etc., but they out males in masculinity, it's a disservice to all the good potential leaders in the world, female and male. So I think that it's quite interesting. You talked about the double bind, and when men are overlooked or disadvantaged or ignored because they have empathy, they're kind and caring, they're not pathologically ambitious, and they have honesty and integrity, that really is an alert or indicator that we need to revise our models. So I think, I'm not a big believer in affirmative action, but I think, at the same time, if we hadn't fined people for not wearing seatbelts, they wouldn't have, and more people would have died. And if you don't tax people for smoking and drinking, more people would smoke and drink, and it has bad consequences. So sometimes you have to force humans to do what is good for them. And in that sense, I think a lot of publicly listed or companies in general are under pressure, reputational pressure, to improve their D&I initiatives, because they're scared of being sued or having a bad image, which means they don't actually believe that there is a benefit in increasing diversity and having more women. But it's okay for me. It's like the second best choice to actually understanding the data and the science and leveraging and unlocking human diversity, because it will still have some role models and more. It will change the new normal, And I think in that sense, if anyone had fallen asleep in the 50s or 60s and woken up today, the world would seem very liberal, progressive, and we have advanced a lot. But by the same logic, I hope that if we fell asleep today and we wake up in 50 years and look back at 2020, it would seem very chauvinistic, very sexist, and we would look at things like lean in as kind of benevolent sexism, because that would mean that we have continued to make progress.
Mm-hmm. That's a wonderful note to sort of end on. So last question for you. Well, how can people find more? So they love this conversation. How do how do they get more of you? And
Well, yes. So you will retweet, and I will retweet, and but the so I think the easiest way is my website, which is drtomas.com. So Dr. Tomas with no H.com. And otherwise, we're in touch. We're a small group trying to make a difference in leadership and talent thinking. So it's if people have listened to this, they already know where to find out more.
Oh, great. Well, this has been such a pleasure. The hour just flew by. Thank you. And I look forward to seeing you maybe in New York, maybe in person.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me. And don't forget to switch off the fire.
Absolutely. Okay. Bye-bye.
Okay. Bye, Rita. Thank you.
Bye.